The girl stood in the center of the trading post yard, her wrists bound behind her with frayed rope that had rubbed her skin raw. She couldn't have been more than 14. Her dress, once white, now stained with dust and something darker, hung torn at the shoulder, exposing a bruise that spread like spilled ink across her collarbone. Her feet were bare, caked in mud, and she stood perfectly still, head bowed, as if she'd learned long ago that moving only made things worse. "Don't look there," she whispered when a man in a wool coat stepped too close, his eyes trailing where they shouldn't. "Please, don't look there." It wasn't a cry for help. It was something quieter, a plea for the smallest mercy, to be invisible even for a moment. Cade Harlow heard her from 20 feet away. He'd ridden into Ashford Station to sell 3 horses, nothing more. He hadn't planned to stay longer than an hour. The trading post was a sagging collection of wood and canvas at the edge of the rail line, the kind of place where men came to do business they didn't want recorded in ledgers. The war had been over for 6 years, but places like this still thrived in the cracks, where law was thin and conscience thinner. Cade dismounted slowly, tying his horse to the post outside the main structure. He was a lean man, weathered by sun and silence, with a scar that split his left eyebrow in two. He wore his hat low, not out of habit but necessity. He didn't like being recognized, not anymore. Inside the yard, a crowd had gathered. 15, maybe 20 men. Some leaned against wagons, others stood in loose clusters, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes and passing a bottle. At the center of it all was a man in a black vest and bowler hat, standing on a crate like a preacher at a tent revival. "The auctioneer." "Now here's a fine one," the man called out, gesturing toward the girl. "Young, strong enough for work, quiet too, give you no back talk. Been sold twice already, so she knows the drill." Laughter rippled through the crowd, low and ugly. Cade's jaw tightened. The auctioneer grinned, showing teeth stained brown from tobacco. "We'll start the bidding at $20, 20 for a girl who'll cook, clean, and keep her mouth shut. Hell, that's cheaper than a good mule." More laughter. A man in a dusty coat raised his hand. 25. 30, another voice called. The girl didn't move, didn't look up. Her lips moved silently, and Cade thought he saw her mouthing something, a prayer, maybe, or a name. 35, someone shouted from the back. Cade's hand drifted to the leather pouch on his belt. He had $60 on him, money he'd saved from months of breaking horses, money he'd planned to use for winter supplies. He didn't know this girl, didn't know her name or where she'd come from, but he knew what this was. Even 6 years after the war ended, even after Lincoln's proclamation, places like this still existed. Hidden auctions in forgotten corners of the West, where people were sold like livestock and lawmen looked the other way because it was easier, or because they were paid to. 40, Cade said quietly. The auctioneer's head snapped toward him. "Well now, we got ourselves a new bidder, 40 from the man in the back. Do I hear 45? The man in the dusty coat scowled. 50. Cade stepped forward into the light. 60. Silence fell over the yard. The auctioneer's grin widened. 60, that's a serious bid, friend. You sure you got that kind of money? Cade pulled the pouch from his belt and tossed it onto the crate. Coins spilled out, glinting in the afternoon sun. Count it. The auctioneer picked up the pouch, weighed it in his hand, then nodded. "Sold, to the quiet man with the deep pockets." He pointed at the girl. "She's all yours, mister, rope included." The crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. The man in the dusty coat shot Cade a look of pure venom before turning away. Cade ignored him. He walked toward the girl, each step deliberate, and stopped a few feet in front of her. She didn't look up. "What's your name?" Cade asked softly. "No answer." "I'm not going to hurt you." "Still nothing." Cade crouched down so he was at her level. That's when he saw it, a thin silver chain around her neck, half hidden beneath the torn fabric of her dress. Hanging from the chain was a small, tarnished locket, the kind a father might give a daughter. His breath caught. He reached out slowly, carefully, and lifted the locket with 2 fingers. The girl flinched but didn't pull away. Cade turned the locket over. On the back, engraved in faint, careful script, were two initials. Elias Rourke. Cade's hand froze. The world around him seemed to tilt, the noise of the trading post fading into a dull roar. He knew those initials. He knew that name. 8 years ago, Cade had ridden with a Union patrol near the Kansas-Missouri border. They'd been tasked with rooting out Confederate sympathizers, farmers, and ranchers. Accused of harboring rebels, it was brutal work, the kind that left scars deeper than bullets. One night they'd surrounded a small ranch outside Lawrence. The commanding officer, a captain named Dalton, had orders to burn it to the ground. The family inside, the Rourkes, had been accused of feeding Confederate deserters. Cade had been there. He'd seen Elias Rourke dragged into the yard, his wife and children forced to watch as soldiers torched the barn and the house. Cade had stood silent. He hadn't pulled the trigger, hadn't lit the fire, but he'd done nothing to stop it. And when the smoke cleared, Elias and his wife were dead, and their children, 2 girls and a boy, had vanished into the night. Now, crouched in the dirt of a trading post, Cade stared at the locket in his hand and felt the weight of 8 years crushed down on him. "Papa promised you'd protect me," the girl whispered. Cade looked up, his heart pounding. She was staring at him now, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow but focused, sharp. "What?" he breathed. "Papa said if anything ever happened, someone would come, someone who owed him." Her voice was barely audible, cracked from thirst and exhaustion. "Are you him?" Cade didn't answer, couldn't answer. Because he wasn't the man Elias Rourke would have trusted. He was the man who'd stood by and let it all burn. Cade untied the rope from the girl's wrists without a word. His hands moved quickly, efficiently, but his mind was somewhere else, 8 years in the past, standing in the firelight while a family's world turned to ash. The girl rubbed her wrists where the rope had cut into her skin. She didn't thank him, didn't speak. She just stood there, swaying slightly, like a sapling in a strong wind. "Can you ride?" Cade asked. She nodded. "Good, we're leaving." He led her toward his horse, a sturdy chestnut mare named Rue. The girl climbed into the saddle without hesitation, moving with the ease of someone who'd spent years on horseback. Cade swung up behind her and nudged Rue into a walk, steering them away from the trading post and toward the open trail. They rode in silence for the better part of an hour. The sun hung low in the west, painting the plains in shades of gold and rust. The girl sat rigid in front of him, her hands gripping the saddle horn so tightly her knuckles turned white. Finally, Cade spoke. "What's your name?" "Silence." "I'm Cade." More silence. He tried again. "You said your father promised I'd protect you. Why would he say that?" The girl's shoulders stiffened. "Because you were there." Cade's stomach dropped. "What?" "The night they came," she said quietly. "You were with them. I remember your face. You stood in the yard and watched them burn everything." Cade pulled Rue to a stop. His hands trembled as he gripped the reins. "I didn't." "You didn't stop them," the girl interrupted. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "You just stood there like all the others." Cade dismounted and stepped away from the horse, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. He turned to face her. "I didn't know they were going to kill your parents. I swear to God, I didn't know." The girl stared down at him, her expression unreadable. "But you knew they were going to burn the house. You knew we'd lose everything." "Yes." "And you did nothing." "Yes." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and damning. The girl climbed down from the saddle. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed over her chest, her bare feet sinking into the dust. "My name is Emma," she said finally. "Emma Rourke. My father was Elias Rourke. My mother was Mary. They're both dead because men like you followed orders without asking questions." Cade looked at the ground. "I know." "Do you?" Emma's voice cracked, the first hint of emotion breaking through. "Do you know what it's like to watch your whole world burn? To hide in a root cellar with your brother and sister while your parents scream? To crawl out the next morning and find them lying in the dirt?" Cade's throat tightened. "Where are your brother and sister?" Emma's face went blank again. "Dead," Samuel got sick 2 winters ago. We couldn't afford a doctor. And Clara, she stopped, swallowed hard. Clara was sold first, 3 years ago. I don't know where she is now. Jesus, Cade whispered. Papa used to say you'd come, Emma continued, her voice distant now, like she was talking to herself. He said if anything happened, someone from the patrol would come back, someone with a conscience, someone who'd remember. She looked at Cade, her eyes hard. I guess he was wrong. Cade took a step toward her. Emma. Don't, she held up a hand. You bought me, you own me. Whatever you want from me, just say it. But don't pretend you're here to save me. You're 8 years too late for that. Cade stood there, the words hitting him like stones. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to say that he'd been young and scared and following orders. But all of that was true, and none of it mattered, because Elias and Mary Rourke were still dead. Samuel and Clara were still gone, and Emma was standing in front of him, broken and hollow, because he'd been too much of a coward to do the right thing. I didn't buy you to own you, Cade said finally. I bought you to get you out of there. Emma's laugh was bitter. And then what? You take me back to your ranch, let me sleep in your barn, and call yourself a hero. That doesn't change anything. No, Cade agreed. It doesn't. Then why, Emma demanded, why did you even bother? Cade looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the girl in front of him, but the family he'd failed. The fire, the screams, the silence that followed. Because I can't undo what I did, he said quietly, but maybe I can do something now. Emma stared at him for a long moment, then she turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. You think that makes it better? No. Good, she looked back at him over her shoulder, because it doesn't. They camped that night under a cluster of cottonwood trees near a shallow creek. Cade built a small fire and gave Emma his coat. She sat wrapped in it, staring into the flames, while he heated a can of beans and made coffee. You should eat, Cade said, holding out a tin plate. Emma took it without looking at him. She ate slowly, mechanically, like someone who'd forgotten what food tasted like. After a while, Cade spoke. I've thought about that night every day for 8 years. Emma didn't respond. I should have said something, Cade continued. Should have refused the orders, should have done something, but I was 22 and I was scared, and I convinced myself it wasn't my place to question a captain. He paused, his voice thick. I was wrong. Emma set the plate down. My father was a good man. He fed those deserters because they were starving, because he couldn't turn away people who needed help, and they killed him for it. I know. Do you? Emma looked at him, her eyes glistening in the firelight. Do you really know what you took from me? Cade met her gaze. No, but I want to try. Emma held his stare for a long moment. Then she looked away, pulling the coat tighter around her shoulders. My father used to carve me little animals out of wood. Horses, mostly. He said I'd have a whole herd someday. Her voice broke. I lost them all in the fire. Cade didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. They sat in silence as the fire burned low, two people bound together by guilt and grief, neither knowing if redemption was even possible. They reached Cade's ranch 2 days later. It wasn't much, a small cabin, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and a corral that needed mending. But it was quiet, and it was far from the trading posts and auction yards where men like Emma had no names, only prices. Emma didn't say much when they arrived. She stood in the yard, looking around with the wary eyes of someone who'd learned not to trust shelter. Cade showed her to the barn, where he'd set up a small space with a cot and blankets. You can stay here for now, he said. I'll work on fixing up the cabin so you can have your own room. Emma nodded, but didn't thank him. That night Cade lay awake in the cabin, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the wind rattling the shutters, the distant call of a coyote, and beneath it all, the quiet voice of his conscience, reminding him that buying someone's freedom didn't erase the fact that he'd helped destroy their life in the first place. 3 days passed. Cade worked the ranch, mending fences and breaking a new colt. Emma kept to herself mostly. She helped with small tasks, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, but she didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then her answers were short. On the fourth day, riders appeared on the horizon. Cade saw them from the corral, 3 men on horseback moving at a steady pace toward the ranch. He recognized the lead rider immediately. Sheriff Dalton. Cade's blood went cold. Dalton had been the captain that night 8 years ago, the one who'd given the order to burn the Rourke Ranch. After the war, he'd traded his Union uniform for a badge, settling in Ashford Station as the town's sheriff. He was a man who knew how to work the system, how to bend the law just enough to line his pockets without breaking it completely. And now he was here. Cade walked to the cabin and grabbed his rifle. By the time he stepped back outside, the riders had reached the edge of his property. Dalton sat tall in the saddle, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. The 2 men with him were hired guns, hard-faced, cold-eyed men who killed for money and asked no questions. "Cade Harlow," Dalton called out, his voice smooth and confident. "Been a long time." Cade didn't lower the rifle, not long enough. Dalton smiled. "Now, that's no way to greet an old friend, especially when I rode all this way just to talk." "We've got nothing to talk about." "I think we do." Dalton's eyes shifted to the barn. "I hear you bought yourself a girl at the trading post. That true?" Cade's grip on the rifle tightened. "What of it?" "Well, see, there's been some complaints. Folks saying you interfered with a legal transaction, that you took something that wasn't rightfully yours." "I paid for her," Cade said, "fair and square." "That's one way to look at it," Dalton said, "but the man who was running that auction, he works for me, and he's saying you caused a disruption, scared off other buyers, cost him money." He leaned forward in the saddle. "Now, I'm willing to let it slide if you hand the girl over." "Not a chance." Dalton's smile faded. "You sure about that? Because the law's on my side here, Harlow. I could have you arrested for interfering with commerce, or worse." "Then do it," Cade said, "but you're not taking her." One of the hired guns shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. Dalton raised a hand, stopping him. "Easy," Dalton said. He looked back at Cade. "You always were stubborn, even back during the war. I remember that night we rode out to the Rourke place. You didn't say a word when I gave the order, just stood there, quiet as a grave." He paused. "But I could see it in your eyes. You didn't agree with what we did." Cade said nothing. "I bet you've been carrying that guilt around for 8 years, Dalton continued. "And now you think saving this girl will make up for it. Am I right?" "Doesn't matter what I think," Cade said. "She's not going back." Dalton's expression hardened. "Then you're a fool, because I will come back, and next time I won't be asking." He turned his horse and gestured to the 2 men with him. They rode off slowly, deliberately, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Cade stood there, watching until they disappeared over the ridge. Then he lowered the rifle and walked to the barn. Emma was sitting on the cot, her knees pulled up to her chest. She'd heard everything. "He's coming back, isn't he?" she said quietly. Cade nodded. "Yeah." "Why didn't you just give me to him?" Cade looked at her, his jaw tight. "Because some things are worth standing for." Emma stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she looked away. "You're going to get yourself killed." "Maybe," Cade said, "but I'm done standing by and doing nothing." That night Cade didn't sleep. He sat on the porch, the rifle across his lap, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. The wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. He thought about Elias Rourke, about the promise he'd never been asked to make but carried anyway. And he thought about the girl in the barn who'd lost everything because men like him had been too afraid to do what was right. Tomorrow Dalton would come back, and when he did, Cade would be ready. The next morning, Cade found Emma outside the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket and staring at the horizon. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. He sat down beside her, not too close, and handed her a tin cup of coffee. She took it without a word. They sat in silence for a while, sipping coffee and watching the light spread across the plains. Finally, Emma spoke. "Why do you live all the way out here?" Cade glanced at her. "Guess I like the quiet." "Or you're hiding." He didn't argue. Emma turned the cup in her hands. "After the fire, we tried to rebuild. Clara, Samuel, and me. We worked for different families, saved what we could. But people knew who we were. They knew what happened to our parents, and most of them didn't care." She paused. "Some of them even said we deserved it." Cade's jaw tightened. "That's not true." "Doesn't matter if it's true," Emma said. "People believe what they want to believe." She set the cup down and pulled the locket from beneath her dress. She opened it carefully, and Cade saw a tiny, faded photograph inside, a man and a woman, young and smiling, Elias and Mary Rourke. "This is all I have left of them," Emma said quietly. "Everything else burned." Cade reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of wood. It was rough-carved, unfinished, but the shape was unmistakable, a horse. "I've been working on this," he said, holding it out to her. "I'm not as good as your father was, but—" Emma stared at the carving, her eyes wide. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. She turned it over in her hands, running her fingers along the rough edges. "You remembered," she whispered. "Yeah." Emma looked at him, and for the first time since they'd met, her expression softened. "Thank you." Cade nodded. "I can make more if you want." "I'd like that." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, the silence between them no longer heavy, but something quieter, something almost like peace. "If you're still with me, think about this. If you were Cade, would you have bought Emma's freedom? Would you have stood against Dalton, knowing it could cost you everything? Take a breath, pour yourself some coffee, and ask yourself, what does redemption really look like? Later that afternoon, Cade was mending the corral fence when he heard hoofbeats. He looked up, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle leaning against the fence post. But it wasn't Dalton. It was a single rider, a man Cade recognized. His name was Henry Morse, an old ranch hand who'd worked cattle with Cade years ago. Henry was in his 50s now, with a graying beard and a limp from a horse that had thrown him a decade back. "Henry," Cade said, lowering his hand, "what brings you out here?" Henry dismounted, grimacing as his bad leg hit the ground. "Heard you had some trouble with Dalton." Cade frowned. "News travels fast." "Always does." Henry glanced toward the barn. "That true, you got the Rourke girl here?" Cade's expression hardened. "If you're here to take her." "Easy," Henry said, raising his hands. "I'm not here to take nobody. I came to warn you. Dalton's gathering men. 5, maybe 6. He's planning to ride out here tomorrow at dawn." Cade's stomach sank. 6 men. "At least," Henry looked at him seriously. "Cade, you can't fight 6 men alone. You'll get yourself killed." "So what am I supposed to do? Hand her over?" "No," Henry said, "but you don't have to stand alone either." Cade stared at him. "What are you saying?" Henry shifted his weight. "I branded calves with you 20 years ago, Cade. I know what kind of man you are, and I know Dalton. He's been using that badge to line his pockets for years. Most folks are too scared to stand up to him, but if you're willing to make a stand," he paused, "well, I reckon there's a few of us who might be willing to stand with you." Cade felt something loosen in his chest. "Henry." "Don't thank me yet," Henry said. "I'm not promising an army, but I'll spread the word, see who shows up." He climbed back onto his horse and tipped his hat. "Be ready at dawn, Cade. Whatever happens, you won't be facing it alone." As Henry rode off, Cade stood there, the weight of the coming day pressing down on him. He looked toward the barn, where Emma was sitting in the doorway, watching him. "Who was that?" she called out. "An old friend," Cade said. Emma walked over to him. "You really think people will help you?" "I don't know," Cade admitted, "but I hope so." Emma looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "My father used to say hope was the only thing they couldn't take from us, even when everything else was gone." Cade nodded. "Your father was a smart man." "Yeah," Emma said softly, He was. That night, Cade and Emma sat by the fire. He carved another wooden horse while she watched, her fingers tracing the edges of the first one. "Why do you think he'll come back?" Emma asked. "Because men like Dalton don't like being told no," Cade said, "and because he knows I won't let you go without a fight." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't want you to die for me." Cade looked at her. "I'm not dying for you, Emma. I'm standing up for what's right. There's a difference." Emma's eyes glistened in the firelight. "I thought all the good men were gone." "Not all of them," Cade said. "Not yet." Dawn came cold and clear. Cade stood in the yard, the rifle in his hands, watching the eastern horizon. Emma was inside the cabin, barricaded behind the heavy oak door. He told her to stay there no matter what happened. The sun crept higher, and still there was no sign of Dalton. Then in the distance, Cade saw movement. Riders, 6 of them, just as Henry had warned. They moved slowly, deliberately, like wolves closing in on wounded prey. Cade's heart hammered in his chest. He checked the rifle, made sure the revolver at his hip was loaded. 6 men. He'd faced worse odds before, but never alone. The riders drew closer. And then from the west, Cade heard it, hoofbeats. He turned, and his breath caught. Henry Morse was riding toward the ranch, and he wasn't alone. Behind him were 4 other men. Cade recognized them all, ranch hands, farmers, men he'd worked beside over the years. They weren't gunslingers or soldiers. They were just ordinary men who decided they weren't going to let cruelty run their county. Henry pulled his horse to a stop beside Cade. "Told you you wouldn't stand alone." Cade looked at the other men, grizzled, weathered, determined. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, we did," one of them said. His name was Jacob, a farmer with a family of his own. "Dalton's been pushing folks around for too long. It's time somebody pushed back." The 6 riders reached the edge of Cade's property and stopped. Dalton sat at the front, his expression unreadable. He looked at Cade, then at the men beside him. "So," Dalton said slowly, "you brought friends." "Wasn't planning on it," Cade said, "but they came anyway." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "You think 5 farmers with rusty rifles scare me?" "Maybe not," Henry said, "but we're not here to scare you, Dalton. We're here to tell you that you're done. No more auctions, no more selling people, no more hiding behind that badge." One of Dalton's hired guns reached for his pistol. Instantly, every rifle on Cade's side lifted. "Easy," Dalton said, raising a hand. He looked around at the men facing him, men he'd known for years, men he'd dismissed as weak and irrelevant, and he saw something in their eyes that made him pause. They weren't afraid anymore. Dalton stared at Cade for a long moment, then he spat into the dirt. "You're making a mistake, Harlow." "Maybe," Cade said, "but it's mine to make." Dalton turned his horse. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Henry said quietly. "Ride away, Dalton, and don't come back." For a moment, it seemed like Dalton might argue, but then he looked at the men again, the rifles, the resolve, and something in him broke. He jerked the reins and spurred his horse forward. The 5 men with him followed. They rode off into the distance, growing smaller and smaller until they were nothing but dust on the horizon. Cade let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He lowered the rifle, his hands shaking. Henry clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good, Cade." "We did good," Cade corrected. The men stayed for a while, sharing coffee and conversation. They talked about the weather, the harvest, their families. They didn't talk about what had just happened. They didn't need to. When they finally left, Cade walked to the cabin. He knocked on the door. "Emma, it's over." The door opened slowly. Emma stood there, her face pale but steady. "They're gone." "Yeah." She stepped outside and looked around, as if expecting to see Dalton still lurking somewhere. Then she looked at Cade. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." Cade nodded. "Come on, let's get you some breakfast." Weeks turned into months. Emma stayed at the ranch. Cade didn't ask her to leave, and she didn't offer to go. She helped with the chores, learned to cook, and slowly, so slowly, began to smile again. One evening, as the sun set over the plains, Cade and Emma sat on the porch. He'd finished carving a whole set of wooden horses, 7 in total. Emma had lined them up on the windowsill inside the cabin. "Do you think my father would be proud of me?" Emma asked quietly. Cade looked at her. "I think he'd be proud of the person you're becoming." Emma nodded, her fingers tracing the locket around her neck. "I miss him every day." "I know." She looked at Cade. "Do you think you'll ever forgive yourself?" Cade was quiet for a long time. "I don't know, maybe not, but I'm trying to do better. That has to count for something." Emma reached over and took his hand. "It does." They sat there as the stars began to appear, two people who'd been broken by the past, but were finding their way toward something like healing. It wasn't redemption, not completely, but it was a start. Years later, people would talk about the day Sheriff Dalton rode out to the Harlow Ranch and rode away empty-handed. They'd talk about the men who stood together, ordinary men who decided that some things were worth fighting for. And in a small cabin on the edge of the plains, Emma Rourke would keep a row of wooden horses on her windowsill, a reminder that even in the darkest places, there are still people willing to stand in the light. Cade Harlow never forgot the fire that had taken the Rourke family. He carried that guilt with him until the day he died. But he also carried something else, the knowledge that he'd finally done the right thing. Even if it was 8 years too late, it still mattered. The sun dipped lower, dust rose around their feet, and in the fading light of the west, two broken souls found something they'd both thought was lost forever: hope.